Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport, 1987. Gate B12. Dawn spills over the Ohio River Valley and paints aluminum in shades of pink and gold. You stand at the glass with coffee cooling in your hand and watch something that should not exist ease into the line. A narrow-body airliner is filling a flight plan that would make a 747 captain glance down at the fuel gauges and then glance again. 3,100 nautical miles to Reykjavik, Iceland, non-stop. The jet that will try this is a single-aisle Boeing 757, a fuselage barely wider than a city bus, a machine that looks like it belongs on shuttle runs to Chicago, yet is about to reach for the North Atlantic with a stride that borders on audacity. This was not supposed to be remarkable. By 1987, the 757 should have been everywhere across the North Atlantic: Pittsburgh to Glasgow, Minneapolis to Dublin, Cincinnati to Amsterdam. That was the vision that lived in sales decks and glossy brochures. Instead, the airplane was about to become the most capable jet flying the wrong routes in aviation history. Ramp crews pushed trolleys over concrete that kept the night stored chill. The pilots climbed aboard with that quiet, earned swagger that comes with surplus performance. The flight plan looked bold in print and strangely natural in the logbook. A workhorse dressed for a sprint and a marathon at the same time. Here is the part almost nobody says out loud. Boeing knew. They absolutely knew the 757 was overpowered. Test crews recorded climb rates that made nearby traffic shout warnings on instruments that were still new to the fleet. During certification, pilots had to fly it poorly on purpose just to show the regulators they could recover from stalls with margin left over. One engineer at Boeing later said they gave it those engines because they could, not because they had to. The effect was a hot rod in a business suit, polite on walk-around, ferocious when cleared for takeoff. To understand how a jet ended up so perfectly wrong for its time and so perfectly right for a future no one pictured, you would have to spool the tape back to the mid-1970s. The Boeing 727 ruled American skies. 3 engines, a T-tail, and a reputation for arriving and departing from fields that made other jets blush. The world around it had shifted. The oil shock of 1973 multiplied fuel prices in a season. Every gallon scorched through to the bottom line in red. The noise rule stiffened and wrapped older fleets in new cost. The 727's 3 engines became a trio of liabilities and a single glance at a monthly statement. A simple reality check glared from every whiteboard. The 727 burned roughly 4,800 gallons per hour. The new generation twins promised around 3,000. Run that across a fleet of 200 aircraft that fly 8 hours a day and the math lands with a thud. Roughly $150 million saved in late 1970s fuel prices. That is not a round of applause in the boardroom. That is survival. Numbers like that can make an airline trade sentiment for spreadsheets before lunch. Inside Boeing's Seattle offices, the argument turned sharp. One camp wanted a final stretch of the 727, one more round of squeezing value from a known shape with known tooling. The other camp wanted a clean sheet twin, 2 engines under the wing, a wing that could lift more with less drag, a cockpit that traded steam dials for glass and logic, a design that would outclimb, outlift, and outsave. The clean sheet won. The internal name was 7N7. The public name would be 757. The brief read like a wish list written by people who remembered both the accountant and the pilot. Double-digit improvements in fuel burn from new high-bypass turbofans, a supercritical wing tuned for low drag at cruise with the muscle to carry heavy on short runways, a 2-crew glass cockpit that removed the flight engineer and simplified flows. The cabin would keep Boeing 6 across comfort, but the engines would move to the wings. Frank Borman at Eastern Airlines pushed hard for that choice. He wanted the ultimate 727 replacement in spirit and in numbers. He wanted a twin that could save fuel today and save routes tomorrow. Boeing played a second game in parallel. Alongside the 7N7, the company drew a mid-sized widebody called the 7X7, soon to be christened the 767. The clever move was to share brains across bodies. Avionics, systems, and philosophy would mirror each other so closely that pilots could earn a common type rating. One pilot could fly a narrow body and a wide body with the same muscle memory. The regulator had never endorsed anything like it. The logic was hard to ignore. 1 training pipeline, 2 aircraft families, a cockpit that looked like home no matter which airframe you walked into after the jet bridge. Think about the schedule that created. A captain could fly a 757 from Boston to Philadelphia in the morning, grab a sandwich, then step into a 767 and point it at London in the afternoon. The checklists would rhyme. The displays would rhyme. The feel would be different through the seat and the yoke, yet the brainwork would click. The first time Boeing explained the plan, a few inspectors smiled like they were hearing a joke. Then they sat in the mock-ups. The smile shifted to frowns of concentration and finally to nods. It was a quiet revolution. The first orders in 1978 made the point. Eastern Airlines and British Airways signed on. Both were classic short to medium-haul carriers that lived on fast turns and tight banks of flights. When Frank Borman and Tex Bouillon shook hands in Miami, they were not buying an ocean ship. They were buying a domestic machine, a workhorse that would launch, land, and launch again. What Boeing actually built beat the brochure. The wings swept at 25 degrees and used a supercritical profile that balanced cruise economy with brawny lift. Slats and double-slotted flaps laid out like a careful thesis on high-lift aerodynamics. The landing gear stood tall on four-wheel bogies, ground clearance for bigger fans, margin for stretches, bones that wanted to grow. Then came the engines. Rolls-Royce shipped RB211 variants that gave way to the red-hot 535 E4. Pratt & Whitney's PW2040 answered with similar punch. Thrust figures in the mid-40,000 range per side arrived like a gym membership for a fuselage that looked lean on the ramp. The thrust-to-weight ratio turned line pilots into poets and pranksters. The 757 climbed like a homesick angel. It looked like a polite sedan and ran like a sports car. Push the levers and it inhaled runway. If you want the field test, go to Tegucigalpa, a valley, hills, a tight descending carve, a short runway, and not much room for second guesses. The 757 did not make the approach easy. It made it survivable with margin. Crews could claw away from terrain that forced narrow jets into sweat and silence. The airplane had the reach and the bite to turn bad days into regular days. The numbers backed the story. Boeing's own planning guide said the jet could leave the ground at maximum weight in under 7,000 feet on a standard day. Put it at altitude and heat in Mexico City or La Paz. Watch thin air steal thrust from others. The 757 shrugged and climbed. Controllers had to rewrite their expectations on first contact. They would clear a 757 like any narrowbody and then watch it blast past traffic twice its size with a steady, unbothered rate. At launch, Boeing promised two sizes: a 757-100 with around 150 to 160 seats, a 757-200 that pushed towards the low 200s in a single-class layout. The smaller jet was supposed to be the true 727-200 capacity replacement. It shared the big wing and the tall gear, and that sharing turned into a weight problem. The little one was heavy for the mission. The economics did not sing. Airlines frowned at trip costs and stepped away. Boeing cancelled the 757-100 before a single tail rolled out. The first hint of the 757's odd destiny sat right there. It would miss the target it was painted to hit and find another target that no one had drawn. Then deregulation arrived like a gust front. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 loosened the old structures that had made trunk routes and big narrow bodies feel inevitable. Networks fractured into waves of higher frequency and smaller gauges. A 6-flight day in a 120-seat airplane could out-earn a 3-flight day in a 200-seat airplane. Southwest proved it daily. They flew 737s into places the majors had ignored and sold the value of choice across the clock. Frequency beat capacity, and the scoreboard made that clear. On short hauls, the MD-80, the 737-300, and later the Airbus A320 family found the sweet spot. Enough seats, enough legs, low enough weight. The 757 looked like a sprinter wandering through a field of middle-distance runners. Sails were steady rather than spectacular. The airplane was respected in the hangar and on the line. It was not loved by accountants who counted cycles before they counted cachet. And then the map bent in a new direction. The same numbers that made the 757 awkward on short hops made it perfect for long, thin routes. Big wing for range, big engines for payload, big climb for flexibility. In 1986, the FAA granted ETOPS to RB211-powered 757s after working through the same logic on the 767. Extended range twin-engine operations, up to 180 minutes to a suitable alternate on a single engine. The rope line around the ocean moved out by hours. Before ETOPS, twins tiptoed along coastlines like cautious swimmers, 60 minutes to a runway, no farther. With ETOPS 180, crews could cut the corner over cold water and go straight to the city people actually wanted. 3 hours on one engine is a technical statement with ice in its voice. For airlines, it was a line drawn across the Atlantic with a bright pencil. Almost overnight, the 757 could cross at a profit with 160 to 180 seats. Secondary cities in the United States and Europe that could not fill a widebody could suddenly support a narrowbody that behaved like a widebody when it mattered. What had looked like a short field excess turned into ocean crossing sufficiency. The airplane built to replace the 727 at home started opening city pairs that had never seen each other on the same departure board. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the transatlantic map gained stitches. Newark to Edinburgh, Washington to Dublin, Boston to Shannon, New York to Manchester. Summer flights to the Mediterranean that seemed impossible in the 1970s suddenly looked normal in the newspaper. Seasonal winds still had a say. On a tough winter's day, westbound flights dropped into Gander to top off and push back out. Fine print on a schedule does not wipe out a business case. The case held. The 757 turned thin lines on a map into seats filled with people who told friends a week later that this new non-stop was a small miracle. No carrier used the airplane's peculiar gifts more completely than Iceland Air. Reykjavik sits like a stepping stone between continents. The 757 could reach it easily from medium American cities and launch again to Scandinavia and to the British Isles. A hub rose from lava fields and smart marketing. The stopover turned a refuel into a vacation ad. The airplane gave shape to a network that looked unlikely and then felt inevitable. Back in the United States, the jet found a domestic crown as well. It did not become the quick-turn workhorse Boeing had sold in 1978. It became the perfect premium transcontinental machine. Los Angeles to New York, San Francisco to Boston, Seattle to Miami. These routes needed range in any weather, resilience for diversions, and enough premium seats for travelers who wanted time certainty and a flat bed. The 757 delivered the block times and the margins. Airlines carved sub-fleets with lie-flat business cabins. Galleys grew more capable. Economy gained legroom where it sold. The airplane did not just make the trip, it made the trip feel short. The revenue told the story. $2,000 for a business seat on a good day from JFK to LAX. 16 of those up front could pay a big part of the day before the main cabin finished boarding. The 737 did not have the same performance for that mission. The 767 carried more airplane than the route wanted. The 757 stood in the middle like it had been carved for the role. Cargo carriers saw the same mix of strengths and signed up. The 757-200PF rolled from the factory with a big main deck door and a main deck ready to swallow containers that looked a size too large for the narrow fuselage. UPS led the way. FedEx joined in. The airplane could lift from fields that didn't love wide bodies and link them to the big overnight hubs. The same thrust that stunned passengers on takeoff gave packages the scheduled discipline that kept promises on doorsteps before breakfast. The type kept evolving. In the mid-2000s, blended winglets showed up on wingtips like tailored cuffs. The look changed. The numbers did too. 5% better burn on many missions. A little more practical range. Enough to make marginal city pairs make sense. Enough to keep the airplane in the game as fuel prices moved and profits thinned. There was even a stretch. The 757-300 looked like someone had taken a 757-200 and pulled it like taffy. It never sold in huge numbers, yet it kept particular carriers happy on leisure trunk routes where density mattered and performance still mattered more than people expected. The long fuselage made taxiway photographers grin. The pilots kept grinning at the thrust levels. Then came the end of the line. In 2003, Boeing announced the close of production. The final passenger 757 went to Shanghai Airlines in April 2005. The official explanation pointed to newer 737s on one side and the coming 787 on the other. The truth ran in parallel. The 757 had grown expensive to build. Wide bodies were gaining efficiency. Smaller twins were learning new tricks. The middle ground the 757 owned was eroding from both edges. Airlines did not wave goodbye quickly. Through the 2010s, a strange thing happened in the used market. Clean, well-kept, 2-decade-old 757s sometimes traded above what they'd cost new in real terms. Planners kept hunting for airframes because the missions did not vanish when the assembly line did. The joke on some earnings calls landed with an edge. We will fly them until the wings fall off. The line meant affection. It also meant there was no clean replacement that could quite do the same set of jobs. Boeing studied a re-engine. They studied it again. They studied it again later. The numbers never smiled. The tooling was gone. The production system had been complex even in its prime. Restart would cost billions, and the order book did not look certain enough to justify the restart. Instead, the conversation turned to a new mid-size airplane that would live between the 737 and the 787. Airlines loved the drawings. Boards loved certainty more than drawings. While Boeing studied, Airbus built. The A321LR arrived with extra tanks and smart weight work. Then the A321XLR extended the idea with even more range. The jet did not pretend to be a 757 clone. It simply slid into the role with newer engines in a factory that was still open. Orders stacked up. The baton passed without ceremony. The routes the 757 had pioneered did not close. They changed tail logos. The irony is neat and a little sharp. Boeing designed the 757 to be the definitive 727 replacement for American domestic aviation. That role went to the smaller 737 family and then shared space with the Airbus A320 family. Boeing expected the 757 to anchor short-haul trunk flying for decades. Deregulation and the logic of frequency handed the day to smaller jets. Boeing planned a family of 757s. The freighter found enduring success. The passenger story bent and then soared in an unexpected direction. What the 757 actually did was more interesting than what it was built to do. It proved that a narrow-body could cross an ocean with poise and profit. It opened dozens of city pairs that had never seen a non-stop and made them feel normal in a single season. It defined what a premium transcontinental product could be and then kept delivering it for years. It gave cargo operators a machine that could carry a meaningful load and still operate from airfields that measured their strengths with a careful ruler. It showed that too much thrust and too much wing can be just enough when the map changes. These are lessons in the metal. Designed for the future you think is coming, then hedged with choices that keep the doors open. Boeing hedged perfectly with 757 and 767 commonality. That one call extended both families through cycles that would have eaten them alive alone. Overcapability is not waste if it creates a market you cannot see yet. The wing that looked too big for LaGuardia helped build Reykjavik into a transatlantic handshake. The engines that looked silly on a ramp in Pittsburgh made winter headwinds a nuisance rather than a veto. Walk any big American airport today and the silhouette still shows up. Long fuselage, tall stance, winglets that look like eyebrows raised in permanent surprise. You hear the bark when the throttles come up and you feel the air wrinkle across the glass. These airplanes fly routes their designers did not imagine. They serve markets that did not exist when the first aluminum barrel met the first jig. They are aging athletes that still put on a show, limber and loud, stubborn in the best way. That is the real story of the 757, an airplane engineered for a future that never arrived, an airplane that built a new future in the space between continents and in the space between coasts. The ultimate 727 replacement that became the narrow body that acted like a wide body, the domestic jet that crossed oceans, the proof that sometimes being too good for the job you were hired to do is exactly good enough for the job the world hands you later. If stories like this scratch your aeronautical itch, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We have more detours ahead on the flight path of human progress. Until then, keep looking up, because every contrail you see has a little of the 757 in it, whether it came from 2 engines, 4 engines, or anything in between.